The snow fell quietly over the high plains, soft as feathers yet cold enough to bite through the thickest coat. The world seemed to hold its breath that Christmas Eve, as if even the wind was reluctant to stir. On the edge of the timberline, where the pines stood like silent sentinels over the frozen ground, a lone figure moved with careful steps. He was a man marked by the years and the land a widowed Apache, his eyes carrying both the sorrow of loss and the quiet strength of someone who had endured storms no one else could see. His name was Tokoda, which in his tongue meant friend to all, though in the years after losing his wife, he had come to feel more like a shadow than a friend to anyone. Takoda's horse trudged through the snow, hooves sinking deep, leaving a trail that led back to a cabin no longer warm with laughter. He had been tracking deer all afternoon, not for sport, but to bring home something for the thin Christmas meal he intended to prepare. The plains were silent, except for the soft crunch of snow and the distant howl of a lone coyote, and yet there was something unusual in the air. Takoda felt at first as a whisper on the wind, a feeling that pulled at the edges of his mind, prickling the hairs on his neck. It was just before nightfall when he saw her. At first, she seemed like a shadow against the gray and white of the snowy clearing, kneeling beside a fallen log as if it were the altar of some quiet miracle. Her dark hair clung to her face, damp with sweat or snow. Tokoda could not tell. But what struck him most was the sound, a sharp, raw cry that was neither animal nor entirely human, yet it pierced the cold night like a bell calling for aid. Tokoda dismounted without a word, his hands steady, his presence calm and commanding. The woman looked up then, panic and pain mingling in her wide eyes. Could see that she was young, far younger than him. Yet there was a resilience there, the kind that made a person endure long nights and harsh winters. She was alone, struggling in the deep snow, and he knew immediately that she was giving birth. For a moment, time seemed to slow. The wind stopped whispering, and even the coyote's howl faded into the distance. Takoda knelt beside her, the weight of the moment pressing down like the frozen sky above. His hands were sure, trained by years of necessity in the wilds, and yet he knew this task was unlike any he had faced. He did not speak at first. There was no need. In the raw simplicity of human struggle, words often became a distraction. The woman's breaths came in sharp gasps, and Takoda's own heart beat a steady rhythm, a grounding force in the storm of her pain. She glanced at him then, her eyes wide with shock, disbelief, and an almost childlike hope. I can't do this alone," she whispered, voice trembling as the first tears streaked her face. Takoda's eyes softened, though he said nothing. His fingers brushed the hair from her forehead, the gesture gentle, unspoken reassurance in a world that had forgotten kindness. He'd been alone for too long, surviving only on his skill and his silence, yet in that moment, he understood a truth he had not known before. Some acts of courage demanded not weapons or cunning, but simply a steady hand and a willing heart. The snow continued to fall around them, covering the earth in a blanket that seemed both cruel and protective. Tokoda adjusted the blanket he carried on his saddle, draping it over the woman as best he could, keeping her warm while shielding her from the wind. She shivered, half from exhaustion, half from the cold, and he murmured words in Apache, old blessings that he had learned from his elders. The language itself was a shield, carrying the weight of generations who had survived storms, attacks, and endless winters. She looked at him, awe and fear warring in her gaze, and something in her lips trembled a question she could not yet voice. Outside, the forest seemed to hold its breath. Koda's mind worked methodically even as his heart thudded. He arranged the snow to form a stable base, guided her through the breathing, the pushes, the agonizing waits between contractions. Every moment stretched, every second weighted with a mix of hope and fear. He had faced danger on the plains, had stared down men with rifles and storms with teeth like iron, but this fragile, bleeding, human miracle was unlike anything he had prepared for. Finally, when the air itself seemed to crack with tension, there was a pause. Tokoda's rough hands moved with precision, his voice calm in the strange hush of Christmas Eve, and then a sound broke through the cry of a newborn, raw and small, yet perfect in its strength. The woman's eyes filled with tears, a mixture of relief, exhaustion, and wonder, and she reached instinctively to touch the tiny, squirming life in her arms. Takoda stepped back slightly, giving her space, yet his presence remained like a silent promise. You are not alone. The moment should have been simple, quiet, sacred. But as the woman stared down at the baby, she realized something that sent a shiver up her spine. Takoda, the stoic, silent man of the plains, had done more than help her survive this night, in his calm and quiet ways. In the way he had guided her through pain without asking for recognition or thanks, he had revealed a strength and compassion she had not expected in a stranger. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. Only the snow whispered, only the wind danced around the trees, and only the fire of human courage burned bright in the cold night. Takoda's gaze met hers, steady, unwavering, and in it she saw not just a man, but a protector, a witness, and perhaps something more. Yet the plains are never fully quiet, and the night never truly safe. Even as she held her child close, feeling the warm life against her chest, the wind carried a distant sound. A shadow moving through the trees, a reminder that the world outside this clearing remained unpredictable, harsh, and unforgiving. She wanted to ask him questions, to understand why he was here, why he had stayed, why he had cared. But the words froze on her lips. Takoda simply nodded once, small and deliberate, as if to say, some things are not meant to be explained, only lived. The baby stirred, the first snow of Christmas Eve still falling, and for a heartbeat. The world was a fragile bubble of life, hope, and disbelief. Then the sound returned, faint at first, almost imperceptible, yet it carried an edge of danger or urgency that made both their hearts tighten. Something or someone was moving closer. Takoda's hand rested lightly on the hilt of his knife, though he had no desire to use it. The woman tightened her grip on her newborn, fear and awe mingling in her eyes. She had survived one of life's most intimate, terrifying moments, but the night still held questions unanswered, shadows yet to be confronted. And in that instant, she realized that this widowed Apache, this silent guardian of the plains, was not only her rescuer, he was a man with secrets, a past heavy with loss, and a courage that could shape the fate of those around him. The snow continued to fall, covering the tracks and hiding the clearing in a white haze. The wind whispered through the pines like a warning, and both of them knew that whatever had brought her here, whatever had allowed him to be there at the right moment, was far from over. The night was young, the child was new, and the wilderness beyond the clearing was patient and relentless. Takoda helped her stand, steadying her against the cold and the trembling of her own body. She glanced at him again, disbelief etched in every line of her face, and for the first time, she allowed herself to truly see him not just as a man of action, but as someone whose presence could change the course of a life in a single night. And yet, before she could speak, the wind carried a new sound, and her breath caught in her throat. The forest was no longer silent, and something or someone was watching. The shadows between the pines stretched longer as the wind shifted, carrying an unfamiliar scent, one that made Takoda's instincts tighten like a coiled spring. He did not speak, only shifted slightly, eyes scanning the darkened forest. The woman, holding her newborn close, felt the tension in his body as if it were her own. Her name, though she had never said it aloud, was Liana, a name her mother had whispered with hope, never imagining the wilderness would test her like this. She had come to the plains seeking solitude, escaping a town that whispered too much and judged too often, yet she had not counted on this night, not the snow, not the pain, and certainly not the quiet guardian who had appeared as if summoned by fate itself. Takoda's horse snorted softly, stepping nervously in the frost, and the sound carried farther than the clearing's fragile calm. Liana clutched the baby tighter, feeling the small warmth against her chest. A fragile ember of life in a world that often seemed indifferent. She wanted to speak, to ask him why he was here, why he had stayed when most men would have turned away, but words failed her. Her throat was tight, and her mind raced with images of what could have been, the loneliness she had carried into the wilderness, the danger she had unknowingly walked into. Takoda finally broke the silence with a soft, deliberate sound in Apache, an old greeting, a bridge of language that carried both respect and warning. Liana did not understand the words, but she felt their weight. It was telling her to stay calm, to trust, but also to be aware. The forest, the night, the unseen watcher, it was all part of a story older than any town or settlement. Tokoda had learned this the hard way. He had survived winters that could kill a man with frostbite in a single night, raids that left entire families broken, and the cruel silence of the plains that had swallowed his wife without mercy. His grief had hardened him, yet this night demanded something different, a presence that could comfort, protect, and act with precision when time and life itself hung in balance. Liana, despite her exhaustion, noticed the careful way Tokoda moved, the respect in his gestures toward her and the baby. It was unlike any man she had ever encountered, strong, silent, and unyielding, yet capable of a tenderness that made her chest ache, she realized, with a shiver. She was seeing the world through a lens she had never known. Survival was not only about endurance, but about who stood beside you when the storm arrived. The baby stirred, and a cry broke the tense quiet. Liana instinctively pressed the child to her chest, rocking gently, and Tokoda watched, alert, his hand resting near his knife. Not for threat, but for readiness. The plains taught a man that danger often arrived unannounced, and that courage meant preparation as much as action. He had faced men with guns, wolves with fangs, and winter storms that could kill a man before he even realized he was in danger. Yet tonight, the threat was unknown, shadowed, and that uncertainty carried a weight heavier than any snowstorm or battle. Liana dared to glance around, trying to see what Tokoda saw. The forest was a moving tapestry of gray and black, the trees swaying under the weight of snow, the wind playing a low song that set her nerves on edge. Her mind flashed back to the journey that had brought her here. She had left the town behind, escaping whispers and judgments, searching for a freedom that felt as fragile as the snowflakes falling on her hair. She had not expected this solitude to become a crucible, where every breath, every step, every heartbeat carried life and death in balance. Tokoda's story was no less steeped in solitude. He had been married once, decades ago, to a woman named Nieli, whose laughter had been brighter than the sun, and whose courage had matched his own. But the plains do not forgive easily. Disease had claimed her in the winter, leaving him with grief so raw that even the howl of wolves seemed a whisper compared to the emptiness in his cabin. Since that day, Tokoda had walked alone, trusting no one, speaking little, and finding solace only in the land and the skills it demanded. Yet, Liana's appearance, the fragile life in her arms, had broken through that solitude in a way he could neither name nor ignore. The wind shifted again, carrying the faint scent of smoke not from any hearth, but from a distant fire, the kind that could signal travelers, hunters, or trouble. Tokoda's eyes narrowed. He knew the plains, knew the sounds and smells that marked both friend and foe. Something moved beyond the tree line, subtle, deliberate, and patient. Liana stiffened, sensing the change, though she did not yet understand what it meant. Her heart beat rapidly, the newborn pressing against her chest, a pulse of life she could not yet protect from what lay unseen. Tokoda moved closer to her, silent, a shadow among shadows. He whispered again in Apache, and though she did not understand, the tone carried urgency. He was preparing her, steadying her, yet keeping the tension contained, as if he alone could bear the weight of what was coming. Liana wanted to ask questions, but fear and awe left her mute. She had never met a man like this, never encountered someone who could inspire trust without words, who could command calm with a simple gesture, a glance, a steadying hand. The snow fell thicker, drifting in curtains that hid the forest floor, making every sound louder, every shadow more menacing. Liana felt as though the world itself was watching, waiting, testing her, testing them both. She clutched the baby tighter, feeling the small warmth, the fragile life, and a surge of protectiveness she had not known she possessed. Tokoda noticed, and without speaking, he adjusted the blanket. Over the child, shielding it from the wind, his movements careful and deliberate. It was more than survival, it was reverence. It's an unspoken acknowledgement of the sacredness of life in a world that often seemed indifferent. The distant fire's smell grew stronger, and with it came another sound, a low, muffled rustling through the underbrush, deliberate and cautious. Tokoda's hand rested on his knife again, though he did not draw it. His eyes scanned the tree line, every muscle coiled, every sense alert. Liana's pulse raced, not just from fear, but from awe at the presence of this man who seemed to see and understand things beyond her comprehension. She realized as she watched him that he carried a world of experience, a life shaped by grief, endurance, and the unspoken code of the plains. And in this moment, That knowledge was her shield. Who's there?" she whispered finally, voice trembling, though Tokoda did not answer. His eyes were fixed on the darkness, unwavering, unblinking, and in his stance was a silent command: wait, watch, survive. Liana followed his gaze, trying to pierce the gray veil of trees, but the forest seemed endless, alive with shadows and full of secrets. She felt a shiver of fear mixed with excitement, a sense that something monumental was about to happen, something that would test them both in ways neither could anticipate. The wind picked up, and with it, a whisper of movement, subtle but deliberate. Tokoda shifted slightly, still silent, and Liana understood without words that they were not alone. That whatever was out there had been watching them, waiting for a moment of vulnerability. She felt the weight of the night pressing in, the cold, the snow, the darkness, and yet with Tokoda beside her, she also felt an ember of hope. Fragile, but real, that they could face whatever was coming. She glanced at him again, the firelight from the distant blaze casting fleeting shadows across his weathered face. There was something unspoken between them, a bond forged in seconds, yet as strong as steel. Hay had saved her, guided her through pain, given her child life, and now, without speaking, he was preparing her for the unknown. She realized that this night, this snow, this lonely stretch of the plains, would be remembered for the rest of her life, not just for the miracle of birth, but for the man who had appeared at the right moment, and the shadow that now loomed beyond the trees, waiting to be revealed. The baby stirred again, and Liana instinctively hummed a soft tune, a melody her mother had taught her. Tokoda's eyes softened slightly, the first sign of emotion he had allowed himself to show. And then the wind shifted once more, carrying with it a faint, almost imperceptible sound, the crack of a branch. The rustle of heavy boots, the whisper of movement that was too deliberate to be the wind alone. Tokoda's hand tightened on his knife, his eyes narrowing as he prepared for whatever was about to emerge from the darkness. The night held its breath, the snow continued to fall, and Liana pressed the child closer to her chest. She realized with a mix of fear and awe that the story of this Christmas Eve was only beginning. The plains had their own plans, the forest its own secrets, and Tokoda, the widowed Apache who had appeared as if from the shadows of legend, was their only link to survival. And as the rustling grew closer, a tension so sharp it could cut through bone filled the clearing, leaving both of them frozen, waiting for the moment that would reveal the true shape of the night's danger. The rustle in the trees grew louder, deliberate, measured. Tokoda's eyes never wavered from the tree line, his posture rigid yet fluid, like a panther ready to spring yet waiting for the right moment. Liana pressed the baby closer, her small hands trembling, but not from cold alone. Her mind raced with questions, each one heavier than the last. Who could be out there at this hour, in this freezing wasteland, when even wolves would have long since retreated to their dens? Was it someone seeking warmth, or was it danger with human teeth? Tokoda shifted slightly, letting the snow muffle his movements. He had faced strangers before, men whose intentions were thinly veiled by polite words or forced smiles. He had survived ambushes and raids, had known men whose greed or cruelty had no boundaries, yet tonight felt different. The forest itself seemed to conspire, each sound exaggerated, each shadow stretching longer. As if the world was holding back something it could not hide any longer. Liana's chest tightened. Every instinct in her screamed to flee, yet she stayed, held by the quiet authority in Tokoda's presence. The distant fire she had smelled earlier flared suddenly, as though someone had struck a flint. Its glow flickered across the snow, and Liana saw a figure step cautiously among the trees, tall, cloaked in shadows, face hidden, her breath caught. Tokoda's hand moved subtly toward the knife at his belt, not in panic, but in preparation. The figure stopped, then began to move in their direction, slow, deliberate, and deliberate enough to suggest it had seen them already. "Who are you?" Liana whispered, but the wind stole her words. Tokoda's gaze never left the figure. His lips pressed into a thin line, and he muttered a short phrase in Apache, a warning and a call for calm. Even as the tension in his body told her that the moment had arrived. This was no casual traveler. Whoever or whatever was out there had reasons, motives, and perhaps a cruelty that matched the merciless wilderness. The figure stepped closer, revealing glimpses of a man's rugged face half hidden under a hood. His eyes glimmered with sharp intent, scanning the clearing, calculating. Dakota's hand tightened slightly on the knife, yet he remained composed. Years of living among the plains had taught him that panic was a weapon stronger than any blade. The one who feared first often lost first. Liana noticed the subtle way Dakota shifted, creating a small barrier between her and the approaching figure, not aggressive but protective, an invisible shield forged by presence and determination. "Evening," the stranger said finally, voice low, hoarse, and carrying a hint of warning. "I didn't mean no trouble, just looking for shelter." His words were smooth, but Dakota's eyes told a different story. Shelter was seldom the only thing a man wanted in the dead of a snowy Christmas Eve. There was calculation here, a tension beneath the politeness. Liana's grip on the baby tightened. She sensed danger she could not yet define. Dakota's voice was quiet but firm when he spoke, again in Apache. Liana did not understand, yet she felt the authority behind it. The stranger's brow furrowed, then he laughed softly, a sound meant to charm, or perhaps intimidate. Dakota remained still, eyes unblinking, and the air seemed to thicken between them. Liana realized that she was witnessing a silent duel, a battle of presence and will, a conflict more dangerous than a gunfight because it had no predictable rhythm. The snow continued to fall, heavy and muffling, creating a world where visibility was limited and danger could emerge without warning. Liana felt the baby stir and whispered softly, hoping her small voice could anchor them both in a fragile human certainty. Dakota's eyes flicked to her for just a moment, acknowledging the tiny life, the vulnerability that was now theirs to protect. It was a reminder that their stakes were higher than pride or suspicion or fear. The smallest heartbeat mattered, and every decision must honor it. The stranger shifted again, pulling something from beneath his cloak. Liana froze, her mind leaping to the worst possibilities. But Dakota's movement was faster, subtle, almost imperceptible, drawing the knife and stepping forward just enough to make the clearing between them clear. The stranger froze in response, surprised by the calm control that radiated from Dakota, and for a heartbeat the world seemed to pause. The wind carried a strange silence, as though the forest itself had stopped breathing, waiting to see who would act first. Then the man spoke again, a little softer, almost conciliatory. "No harm meant. Just need a place to wait out the storm." His eyes flicked to the baby, and Liana felt her chest tighten. There was an intention in that glance she did not like. Dakota's voice, again calm, low, unwavering, held weight in every syllable, warning the man without raising a hand further. Liana realized suddenly that whatever skills this stranger possessed, he had underestimated the widowed Apache in front of him. The night stretched, the tension thick enough to taste. Snowflakes drifted across the clearing, landing on the cloak of the stranger, catching in Liana's hair and even on the small blanket wrapped around the baby. Time slowed, moments stretching into what felt like hours, every shadow a possible threat, every sound amplified. Liana thought of the journey that had brought her here, the isolation, the labor in the snow, the miracle of her child, and realized that the world had a way of testing people all at once, when they were at their most vulnerable. Behind the stranger, movement stirred. Dakota's eyes flicked briefly to it, noting shapes that blended with the trees. He did not speak. He had learned that, in moments like these, words often betrayed more than action. Liana, however, could see the tension in his jaw, the way his hands flexed, and she understood, without being told, that more than one threat may have been present all along. The plains never offered clarity, only instinct and observation. "Do you travel alone?" Dakota asked finally, his voice low, measured. There was no warmth in it, no invitation, only fact. Liana noticed the stranger flinch slightly, and the answer, a single word, came with hesitation. Yes, but Dakota's eyes did not leave him. Solitude, Dakota knew, could be as deceptive as companionship. The plains taught a man that loneliness could hide danger as easily as it could reveal truth. Liana shivered at the layers of meaning she was beginning to understand. The stranger moved closer again, but this time more cautiously. Dakota shifted slightly, guiding Liana behind him without overt gesture, a subtle movement that spoke volumes. He had trained himself for these moments, where strength was measured in presence, where decisions could tip life or death. Liana realized, with a growing awareness, that she had stepped into a story much larger than her own. A narrative shaped by courage, instinct, and the hidden dangers of the wintered plains. A sudden noise from deeper in the trees, a snapping branch, followed by a muffled grunt made both Dakota and the stranger freeze. The forest seemed to lean in, listening. Liana clutched the baby tighter, rocking gently, whispering small sounds meant to comfort. Her own fear was sharp, but beneath it stirred awe. She saw Dakota's careful control, the way he scanned, assessed, and prepared without panic. This was the man who had saved her at birth, and now, perhaps, he was saving them again from dangers they could barely perceive. The stranger, sensing the shift, held up his hands slightly, a gesture meant to appease, yet his eyes darted toward the tree line, betraying his own tension. Liana noticed the flicker of worry cross his face, and it revealed a truth she had suspected. This was no ordinary encounter. The plains had its own law, and Dakota was a man who embodied it. The stranger had intruded into it without realizing the depth of what he was stepping into. The snow fell heavier now, the world reduced to white and shadow, the sounds muted except for the occasional rustle. Liana whispered her thanks to Dakota, though he did not respond. His attention never wavered, scanning the darkness, measuring every movement, every sound. The baby stirred again, and she felt its heartbeat, tiny but steady, an anchor in the swirling tension of the clearing. Another movement in the shadows, faint but deliberate, reminded her that the night was far from safe. Dakota's hand moved just enough to indicate readiness, not aggression. Liana realized that survival was no longer a solitary matter. Not just hers, nor Dakota's alone, but bound together in the fragile thread of trust and instinct. The stranger stepped back slightly, perhaps recognizing the unspoken hierarchy, the force of presence that could not be challenged by words or threats. The forest seemed endless, each tree a potential hiding place for danger, each shadow a whispered threat. Liana's mind raced, her body tense, yet she clung to the small warmth of her child and the steady presence of Dakota. She realized that the night, the snow, and the stranger were only part of the story. The greater challenge lay in understanding who she could trust, would protect life when the plains offered only silence and uncertainty. Dakota's gaze flicked back to her, brief, intentional. In that look, Liana felt the weight of unspoken questions, the magnitude of what had happened and what was yet to come. The snow fell thicker, the wind moaned through the trees, and the stranger watched, calculating, wary, but no longer confident. The night stretched before them, long and uncertain, and Liana understood that this was only the beginning of a story that would test courage, instinct, and the fragile boundaries between life and death. The plains had a way of revealing character, of forcing decisions in moments when hesitation could mean ruin. And as Dakota adjusted the blanket around the baby, shielding it from the wind, Liana knew that survival was no longer simply about endurance. It was about trust, it's about courage, and about the choices that would define the night. The forest seemed alive now, a presence pressing in from all sides. Every snow-laden tree became a possible threat, every shadow a hidden watcher. Dakota's eyes never left the tree line, scanning the darkness with the patience of a predator and the wisdom of a man who had learned the harshest lessons of the plains. Liana felt her heart pounding in her chest, matching the rhythm of the tiny life she held against her own. The baby's cries, though small, seemed amplified by the stillness, a fragile echo of hope in the frozen night. The stranger's eyes darted again, restless, calculating. He had underestimated Dakota, that much was clear, yet he had his own cunning, his own survival instincts sharpened by life on these unforgiving lands. Liana sensed that there was more to him than he revealed, a tension beneath his words and movements that spoke of secrets and stakes unseen. She pressed the child closer, realizing that she had become a part of something larger than herself, a drama written in shadows and snow, survival and courage. Dakota shifted slightly, his hand brushing the knife, not in threat but in readiness. The forest whispered around them, branches creaking, snow falling in small avalanches from heavy boughs. Every sound seemed louder, every rustle magnified. Liana could feel the tension rising, not just in herself, but in the very air. It was as if the plains were holding a breath, waiting for a moment that would decide the night. The stranger took another cautious step forward. His voice, now quieter, carried a forced calm. "I just want passage. Nothing more," he said. But there was a twitch in his jaw, a flicker in his eyes that betrayed impatience, and Tokoda saw it all. Years of reading people in the wilds had honed him to notice the slightest movement, the smallest change in expression. Liana watched, silent and tense, as the two men measured each other, a battle of instincts rather than weapons. Suddenly, a snap of a branch came from deeper in the forest. Both men froze instantly. Tokoda's eyes narrowed, scanning the darkness beyond the stranger. Liana felt the weight of her fear and awe simultaneously. She realized that while she had survived the birth alone in the snow, the night was far from over. Danger was moving toward them, and the plains had many ways of testing those who dared to tread their frozen paths. The wind shifted sharply, carrying an acrid scent of smoke closer now. Tokoda's nostrils flared. This was no casual campfire. Someone had built a fire with purpose, or worse, with intent to track and trap. Liana's grip on the baby tightened instinctively. She had fled judgment in her town to find peace in the wilderness, yet here, in the cold, snow-covered forest, she understood the raw unpredictability of life. And Tokoda, standing beside her, was the only anchor against the unknown forces closing in. A low rustle came from behind a nearby thicket. Tokoda moved subtly, positioning himself between Liana and the movement, his body coiled and ready, yet calm. The stranger noticed it too, and took a hesitant step backward, calculating, wary. Liana could see the tension flicker across his face. He had intended to intimidate, to assert himself, yet now he realized that the widowed Apache was not a man to be bullied or tricked. "Stay close," Tokoda whispered, barely audible, and Liana obeyed instinctively. Pressing against his side, shielding the child beneath her cloak, the baby stirred again, soft whimpers that seemed impossibly small against the rising tension. But the sound carried, and whatever waited in the darkness had already registered it. Liana's pulse raced. She felt like the world had contracted to the clearing, the trees, and the fragile circle of life she now protected. The stranger's voice broke the silence again, but now it carried unease. "You don't have to be hostile," he said. His eyes flicked to the shadows as though he sensed the presence that Tokoda had been watching for, but could not yet see. Tokoda's gaze stayed fixed on him, unwavering, silent. Liana realized that the stranger was caught between fear and caution, trapped in a moment where a single misstep could mean disaster. From deeper in the forest, another sound emerged, a crunch, deliberate, slow. Tokoda tensed, muscles ready to react instantly. Liana held her breath. The snow seemed heavier now, each flake falling slower, each step of the approaching figure audible in the frozen hush. Tokoda's hand moved slightly, adjusting the blanket over the baby without breaking eye contact with the stranger. It was a small human gesture in a night filled with tension, but it carried a weight that Liana could feel in her bones. The figure emerged at last, cloaked in darkness, its movement deliberate, steady. Liana caught a glimpse of a glinted knife, a tool, something sharp, and her stomach dropped. Tokoda's eyes narrowed. He'd encountered men like this before, men who thrived in fear, who calculated their advantage with patience and cruelty. But he had also survived them all, not through rash action, but through calm strategy and the ability to read the world with eyes few others could wield. Liana's mind raced. She had survived the labor, the snow, the isolation. But this confrontation, the silent threat moving toward them, felt impossible. Her thoughts turned to the baby, to the fragile life against her chest, and she realized that courage was no longer an abstract idea. It was the choice to hold on, to trust, to act in alignment with someone who had proven himself capable, even in moments she had thought impossible. The stranger's gaze flicked toward the approaching figure, then back at Tokoda. He took a step forward, then hesitated, weighing options, testing the resolve of the man before him. Tokoda remained still, voice quiet, words few, but every gesture commanding. Liana realized that the battle was no longer just about survival. It was about authority, perception, and the delicate balance of life and death. From the shadows, the third figure stepped fully into the clearing, revealing features hidden in the night, all rugged, a presence that seemed to carry the forest itself. The The figure paused, eyes scanning the small group, assessing. Liana felt the tension spike. She clutched the baby tighter. Dakota's hand brushed hers in a brief, grounding gesture, a silent promise that he would not fail. The stranger flinched slightly, realizing that the odds had shifted in a way he had not anticipated. The wind picked up, carrying with it a swirl of snow that momentarily obscured vision. When it cleared, the figures were positioned now in a tense triangle. Each movement mattered. Each breath was amplified. Liana could feel the raw stakes pressing down, her mind alternating between fear and awe. She realized that this moment, this night, would be etched in her memory forever, not for the snow, nor the cold, nor even the birth of her child, but for the unrelenting tension, the courage, and the quiet heroism of the man beside her. Dakota finally spoke, his voice calm, commanding, carrying authority without threat. The stranger hesitated, evaluating, then spoke again, voice edged with uncertainty. "Only want to pass," he said. But Dakota's stance, the sharpness in his gaze, the readiness in his movements, spoke louder than words. The confidence of a man who had faced death countless times and who now carried the fragile lives of two innocents in his care. From deeper in the forest, movement stirred again. Dakota's hand dropped slightly, signaling awareness. Liana realized that the night was far from over, that the unknown still lurked beyond sight, and that whatever was coming could decide everything in a heartbeat. The snow fell heavier, the baby stirred, and the clearing became a crucible of life, instinct, and the raw tension of the human spirit. Dakota's gaze met hers briefly, a silent reassurance. The stranger's stance shifted again, more cautious, more aware of the strength he faced. And the wind carried yet another sound, a rustle, a snap, subtle but deliberate, as though the forest itself was holding secrets it had yet to reveal. Liana's heart raced. She understood now that the night was not only a test of survival, but a measure of courage, trust, and the unspoken bonds forged in moments of true danger. Every second stretched, the snow masking sound and amplifying fear. The stranger, now aware of the full scope of what he faced, took another step back, calculating, uncertain. Dakota remained still, prepared for anything, every instinct tuned to the fragile balance of life around him. Liana felt her own tension sharpen, knowing that the climax of the night, the revelation of the threat, the test of courage and the choices that would define survival was drawing closer. The clearing seemed suspended between moments, snowflakes falling like frozen seconds, and the wind whispering secrets Liana could not yet understand. Dakota adjusted the baby's blanket again, a simple act of care in a world thick with danger. The stranger's eyes flicked toward the tree line once more, sensing, fearing, calculating. And Liana realized with a shiver that the story of this night, this Christmas Eve, was not over. The danger, the suspense, and the test of courage were about to reach a peak, a moment where choices would define life and death, trust and betrayal, fear and hope. The wind shifted again, carrying the scent of pine and snow, but also a faint smoke that now seemed less threatening and more distant. Dakota's eyes softened ever so slightly, though he never relaxed fully. Liana felt the tension in the clearing ease just a fraction, the first sign that the night's ordeal was moving toward its conclusion. The stranger, whose name she would later learn was Corvin, paused, eyes scanning the trees, now clearly reconsidering his earlier approach. Whatever intent he had brought into the forest, it had been measured against the quiet authority of the widowed Apache, and he had realized that force alone could not win here. Liana clutched her newborn, pressing the child close against her chest, feeling the warmth and fragile heartbeat that had carried them through the worst of the storm. She dared a glance at Dakota, who now moved slowly toward her, deliberate in each step. He adjusted the blanket around the baby, making sure that both mother and child were shielded from the cold wind. The small gestures, the quiet attention to detail, struck her more profoundly than any words could have. She felt a deep awe at the man who had appeared in her darkest hour, who had guided her through both birth and danger without hesitation or expectation. Corvin finally lowered his gaze, perhaps acknowledging the unspoken truth in Dakota's presence. His stance relaxed, though he did not move closer. Dakota's eyes remained steady on him, calm but unyielding. The clearing, which had been taut with suspense and fear, now carried a fragile quiet, as though the forest itself recognized that the immediate danger had passed. Liana breathed deeply, allowing herself a moment to register what had just happened. The night had tested her courage, her instincts, and her trust in a man she barely knew, and yet she had survived, holding her child close and learning a lesson she would carry forever. "Thank you," she whispered finally, her voice soft but filled with emotion. Tokoda's gaze flicked toward her, and for the first time he allowed himself the smallest hint of a smile. It was not a wide grin, not a laugh, but it was enough to convey the unspoken bond that had formed between them in the quiet of the snow-covered clearing. His presence had not only protected her life, but had created a space of safety and trust in the midst of uncertainty and fear. The snow continued to fall, gentle now, almost like a blessing over the frozen earth. Tokoda moved toward the distant trees, checking the path for any remaining signs of danger. He gestured for Corvin to step aside, to allow the woman and her child to move safely back toward the small shelter Tokoda had prepared in the clearing. Liana followed, holding the baby tightly, and felt a profound sense of gratitude and relief. Every step was a reminder of how fragile life could be, and how courage and presence could make all the difference. As they moved toward the temporary shelter, Tokoda spoke quietly, explaining what had been necessary to ensure their safety. He described the signs in the forest, the movements that had indicated another presence, and how instinct, observation, and patience had kept them alive. Liana listened intently, absorbing not only the practical wisdom, but the life lessons embedded in his words. She realized that courage was not always about action in the moment, but about preparation, presence, and awareness. Tokoda had taught her that in ways she could never forget. Corvin watched them, now clearly reassessing his own understanding of the plains and the people who lived by them. He had arrived with one plan, one expectation, and found himself confronted by someone whose strength came not from brute force but from knowledge, discipline, and an unwavering sense of purpose. Liana sensed the shift in him, a quiet respect replacing whatever tension had brought him into the forest that night. It was a reminder that courage and integrity could inspire even those who had once seemed like potential threats. Inside the shelter, Tokoda helped Liana settle onto a small blanket he had spread out, ensuring the baby was comfortable and warm. The fire he had started with careful hands now crackled softly, casting a glow across the faces of mother, child, and protector. Liana felt the exhaustion wash over her, the adrenaline ebbing, leaving her body trembling but her heart full. She looked at Tokoda and finally understood the depth of what had been given to her that night: protection, guidance, and a demonstration of humanity at its most profound. Tokoda spoke again, quietly sharing stories of his past, of loss and survival, of the plains and the lessons they had taught him. Liana listened, captivated, realizing that each story was more than history. It was a map for living, a guide for courage in moments of uncertainty. She shared a little of her own story as well, the journey that had brought her into the wilderness, her need for solitude, and the hope she had carried for a fresh start. In the glow of the firelight, their stories intertwined, creating a tapestry of human resilience, trust, and connection. The baby stirred again, tiny fingers brushing against Liana's chest. She smiled through her exhaustion, feeling a profound gratitude for life itself and the unexpected ways it could be preserved and protected. Tokoda watched her, his eyes gentle, and she realized that he too had been changed by the night. The solitude he had carried for years was softened, if only slightly, by the act of helping another life into the world and safeguarding it from danger. In that moment, the bond between them was undeniable, a quiet understanding born of shared experience and trust. Corvin, standing near the edge of the shelter, finally spoke again, his voice quieter now, tinged with respect. "I misjudged you," he admitted. "The plains, they're not for the careless." Tokoda nodded, accepting the acknowledgement without further comment. Liana sensed that the forest had taught another lesson that night, not just to her, but to all who had crossed its snow-covered paths. Courage, wisdom, and respect were the currencies that kept people alive, and Tokoda had given them freely, expecting nothing in return. The snow outside continued to fall gently, harsh winds that had driven the night's tension fading into quiet, as if the world itself was breathing again. Liana rocked her baby, feeling the warmth and fragility of new life. She realized that the night had been a crucible, testing her fears, her instincts, and her trust. She had survived not only because of her own courage, but because of Takoda's presence, his knowledge, and the unwavering humanity he had shown. It was a lesson she would carry forever. Life could be harsh, but even in the coldest, loneliest moments, acts of kindness and courage could shine like fire in the snow. Takoda moved to the doorway of the shelter, scanning the horizon one last time. The forest seemed quiet, still, and safe for now. Returned to the fire, sitting beside Liana and the baby, offering what warmth remained. She looked at him, a question on her lips, and he simply nodded, a silent acknowledgement that the danger had passed, that the night's trials were behind them. She felt a wave of relief and awe, realizing that the man who had appeared in the darkness had become her guardian, her protector, and perhaps the reason this Christmas Eve would be remembered forever. As the hours passed, Liana and Takoda spoke quietly, sharing stories and dreams. The baby slept peacefully between them, a small symbol of life, hope, and resilience. Liana realized that in the harsh wilderness, where snow and darkness could conceal danger, human connection was the most precious gift of all. She had come seeking solitude, but what she had found was trust, courage, and the knowledge that, even in the coldest night, warmth could be found in the hearts of those willing to act with compassion and strength. When dawn finally broke, pale and gentle over the snow-covered plains, Liana stepped outside with her child in her arms. Takoda stood beside her, watching the horizon, as silent and steady as the mountains themselves. The forest was quiet now, the threat gone, leaving only the promise of a new day. Liana breathed in the crisp air, feeling the weight of the night lift, replaced by gratitude, awe, and a profound sense of peace. The baby cooed softly, and she smiled, knowing that life, fragile and precious, had been preserved against incredible odds. Corvin departed quietly, leaving them with a nod of respect, a reminder that even those who once seemed a threat could recognize courage and honor when they saw it. Liana turned to Takoda, feeling an emotion she could not name, fully gratitude, wonder, and something deeper. Met her gaze, and in his quiet way, conveyed what words could not, that courage, kindness, and trust were the true measure of a life well lived. As they walked back toward Takoda's cabin, snow crunching softly beneath their boots, Liana realized that this Christmas Eve would remain forever etched in her memory. The forest, the snow, the danger, and the miracle of birth had taught her a lesson that no town, no judgment, no solitude ever could. Life was fragile, yes, but it was also resilient. Courage could come in the form of a steady hand, a calm presence, and a willingness to act when others faltered. And in the form of a widowed Apache who had appeared when she needed him most, she had found proof that even in the coldest nights humanity could shine brighter than any fire. The cabin's warm glow welcomed them, and as Liana placed the baby in a small cradle, she felt a sense of completion, of safety, and of hope. Takoda sat beside her, his eyes reflecting the firelight, and she knew that the bond formed that night would endure far beyond the snow and shadows of the plains. The trials had passed, but the lessons remained. Courage, trust, and the quiet power of human connection were the true gifts of life, stronger than fear, stronger than cold, and brighter than the harshest night. Outside, the snow continued to fall softly, covering the tracks of the past night, leaving only a pristine white landscape as a witness to courage, hope, and the enduring spirit of life. Liana held her child close one last time, feeling warmth, gratitude, and awe. The world was harsh, yes, but it was also capable of miraculous grace. And in the presence of Takoda, the widowed Apache whose strength and compassion had changed the course of her life, she knew that even the loneliest heart could find trust, even the most desperate night could end in hope, and that every Christmas Eve could hold the possibility of a miracle waiting quietly in the snow.